Does every faith truly need a flag planted in the world of men? Must every sacred word be written down, sealed and locked behind stone doors? In the bright halls of cathedrals, we often forget that faith began as a whisper in the dark, a glance, a question with no answer. But when human power puts on the robes of heaven, the mysteries of God are filed, ruled, and guarded. Who gave them that right? And what was buried to make that right possible? Not every truth is carved into Scripture. Not every commandment came from above. If you've ever wondered what hides beneath the vestments of those who claim to speak for the divine, then come closer, quieter. There is something you should hear. Let deformed history be your companion. We'll move slowly like footsteps in candlelight, uncovering what was meant to be forgotten. The incense curls in the air like silent questions unanswered for centuries. Somewhere deep inside the ancient stone of the Vatican, there is a room no one enters. Or so they say. No light spills through its sealed door. No footsteps echo beyond its iron lock. What lies inside? A relic too dangerous to be seen. A truth too fragile to survive the air. The official records do not mention such a room. The guards, when asked, smile without answering. Some whisper that it once held a letter a single page that could undo the pillars of the church. Others say it is empty, and that the emptiness itself is what must be hidden. But no one truly knows, or no one dares to say. This is not just a tale of lost rooms or secret vaults. It is a story of power, of the strange and uneasy intersection between faith and control. It begins with a question quiet but insistent. Why must the divine always speak through those who wear robes and rings? Why must we believe that heaven has a bureaucracy? Long before the Vatican rose from the swamps of Rome, long before Peter was declared the first pope, faith lived in caves and deserts. It flickered in the eyes of outcasts, it burned in the mouths of mystics. It was not centralized. It had no keys, no doors, no vaults. The early Christians hid in catacombs, not palaces. They wrote on scraps, not gold. They shared bread, not indulgences. Then came Constantine. The moment the church became official, sanctioned, protected, aligned with empire, something shifted. Faith became an institution. The sacred was no longer wild or untamed. It was given rules, ranks, and rituals. The Pope became not just a shepherd, but a sovereign. And with that sovereignty came something else, the need to control the story. Which books are holy? Which visions are true? Which voices are heresy? Suddenly the answers to those questions weren't given by prophets in the wilderness. They were delivered from marble thrones penned by scribes in the dim glow of candlelight, stamped with seals no common man could challenge. The words of God, once scattered and living, became centralized, edited, and chained to authority. And yet, not all voices were silenced. There were monks who copied texts not found in the official canon. There were pilgrims who returned from the East with stories that did not match the Gospels. There were Gnostic scrolls buried in the sands of Egypt, whispering of a Jesus who taught not obedience, but inner awakening, a divine spark hidden in all, not just in those ordained. These fragments threatened the foundation, not because they were false, but because they were uncontrolled. The church, as it grew in power, developed a second skin, the management of memory. It was not enough to preach the truth. The truth had to be curated. Anything that contradicted the narrative was labeled dangerous, heretical, even demonic. Scrolls were burned, libraries were emptied, witnesses disappeared into the silence of history. Is it possible that entire gospels vanished this way? Could there have been a different story of Christ, one that asked for no church at all? The Nag Hammadi texts discovered in 1945 by a farmer in Egypt suggest as much. Among them is the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, many of which never appear in the New Testament. In it, he says, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me." There is no call for hierarchy, no mention of Rome, no suggestion that salvation lies in obedience to any institution. Why then was this gospel forgotten for so long? Or was it deliberately buried? The Vatican did not welcome the discovery. Scholars close to the Church dismissed the texts as Gnostic fantasies. But the timing is curious. Just as the world was reeling from war, just as faith in institutions was being shaken, this alternative voice emerged from the sand, a voice that pointed inward, not upward. If the divine lives in us all, what need is there for a representative? What need is there for a gatekeeper? And yet the Vatican persists, not just as a religious center, but as a sovereign state with its own bank, its own army, its own archives. It holds secrets that have not seen daylight in centuries. Some say it has the largest library in the world, inaccessible to almost everyone. What lies within early Christian texts, lost prophecies, ancient agreements between the Church and empires now fallen. Why would the Church guard these things so tightly? Who are they protecting, us or themselves? And how did we come to accept that the divine must be filtered through human power? There is no single answer, only threads and shadows, and the lingering sense that the story we've been told is not the only one that could have been. So we return to that sealed room, the one no one enters. Perhaps it is only a legend. Perhaps it is just a symbol, a metaphor for the truths locked away behind centuries of tradition and control. Or perhaps there really is a door, and behind it something so fragile, so powerful, so human, that even the Church cannot allow it to breathe. What would happen if the lock were broken? What might we see in that first shaft of light? They say Peter was given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. But who gave him the keys to the kingdoms of men? In paintings, he is often shown holding two great keys, one gold, one silver. Symbols, we're told. One for spiritual authority, one for earthly power. But why both? Why must divine grace always be entangled with temporal control, and when exactly did those keys become instruments, not just of faith, but of governance? The early followers of Jesus had no cathedrals, no property, no kings at their side. Their gatherings were quiet, scattered, and often illegal. They broke bread in secret, wrote letters from prison, and shared stories of a teacher who walked barefoot and asked for no titles. They did not crown themselves vicars of Christ. They followed his footsteps. Yet over the centuries, that soft barefoot path hardened into marble floors. Crowns replaced thorns, thrones replaced crosses. The vicar became a monarch, and the Church a kingdom unto itself. What changed? Perhaps it began when the divine was no longer enough. Power once tasted requires preservation, and preservation demands structure, rules, walls, gateways, and gatekeepers. To speak for God, what a temptation, what a burden, what a weapon. The idea of apostolic succession, the belief that the authority of Peter was passed down through the popes, is not universally accepted even among early Christian communities. For centuries, bishops across different cities claimed spiritual leadership. But Rome had something more. It had imperial memory, infrastructure, the echo of Caesar in every column, and most of all, it had the tomb of Peter, or so they claimed. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine ordered the construction of the first great basilica over a site believed to be Peter's burial place. No proof was offered, no body was shown. But belief is powerful, especially when it serves empire. The tomb gave the papacy roots. It made Peter real physical, and therefore controllable. A tomb can be guarded, a myth cannot. And so the authority of the Church began to solidify, not through the spirit, but through stones, through relics, bones, shrines, ceremonies. The Pope was not just a bishop among bishops. He became the keeper of Peter's legacy, the one who held the keys. And to question him was to question the entire scaffolding of Christian history. But what if that scaffolding was built upon choices? What if different gospels, different voices, different truths were simply left out? The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is often described as a theological gathering, but it was more than that. It was an imperial standardization. The emperor, not a theologian, presided. Books were chosen. Doctrines were fixed. Alternate ideas, Arianism, Gnosticism, Docetism, were condemned, their texts destroyed or hidden. One version of the faith triumphed. One voice declared itself universal Catholicus, but whose voice was silenced. And more hauntingly, what did they know? A few surviving fragments hint at very different Christianities. In some, Jesus was a man who became divine through knowledge. In others, he was never flesh at all, just spirit in disguise. Some texts suggest Mary Magdalene was his closest confidant, entrusted with teachings the male disciples never received. These were not comfortable ideas for a hierarchical church led by men. So they were buried. Literally, until the earth gave them back. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The Nag Hammadi Library. Texts found not in basilicas, but in caves. Preserved not by priests, but by time itself. What do we make of these forgotten words? Are they dangerous lies? Or inconvenient truths? And who gets to decide? It is worth noting that for centuries, lay people were forbidden from reading the Bible in their own language. Latin was the sacred tongue, not because God spoke Latin, but because it kept the words in the hands of those trained to wield them. To interpret Scripture was to hold power. And power rarely invites others to the table. Even today, the Vatican's archives remain largely closed, a fortress of parchment and prophecy. Some of the documents are centuries old, never published, never studied outside its walls. What secrets are kept in such silence? What letters lie unread? What visions were recorded and then suppressed? Could there be testimonies of miracles denied, of saints erased, of doctrines reversed? There are rumors, of course, a papal prophecy hidden from the world, a secret gospel that challenges the virgin birth, a letter from Galileo not of repentance but defiance. None of these are proven, but the absence of proof in such a guarded vault is no comfort. It is only a deeper question. What would happen if we saw everything? If every document were laid bare, every contradiction exposed, would faith crumble, or would it finally breathe? And again we return to the keys, one for heaven, one for earth, one unseen. What if the real power lies not in holding the keys, but in deciding which doors remain locked? The Church says it acts in God's name, that it protects the flock, that its secrecy is a form of reverence. But history teaches us that reverence and fear often walk side by side, and that the most sacred things are sometimes hidden, not because they are too holy, but because they are too human. A crack in marble, a whisper behind the curtain, a forgotten book in a sealed room. These are not just relics of the past, they are signals, traces of a question no key can truly answer. What if God never asked for a representative? What if he never needed one? In the silence of the Vatican archives, beneath centuries of dust and stone, lies a document no one speaks of by name. Its catalog number is known only to a few, its contents rumored. Some say it's a letter unsigned, undated, written in Greek, folded into the pages of an obscure medieval codex. Others say it's not a letter at all, but a confession, a record of a choice made long ago, a choice to erase. Not a scandal of flesh or money, but something more dangerous, a contradiction at the heart of the Church's foundation. What if the story that began in Bethlehem did not end in Rome? What if the power to bind and loose, to forgive and condemn, was never meant to be institutionalized? These questions are not new. They echo in the quietest corners of history. In the burned pages of the Albigensians, the silenced chants of the Beguines, the fragmented testimonies of mystics who disappeared without trial. And always behind them a presence, subtle, immense, of an institution tasked with protecting truth, by deciding what truth is allowed to be. But who gave them that task? Consider this: in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there were dozens of gospel accounts circulating across the Roman world. Some told of a Jesus who laughed on the cross. Others described a Christ who never suffered bodily pain. There were writings that made no mention of crucifixion at all, but instead described inner visions, symbols, paradoxes. The Christ of those texts was a teacher of riddles, not a king, not a sacrifice, but a mirror reflecting something inconvenient. If the divine lives in every soul, why appoint a single gatekeeper? If grace is internal, what role is left for power? As the Church grew, those texts were deemed dangerous. Not because they were false necessarily, but because they were unmanageable. Their meaning slipped like water through the fingers of authority. And the people who clung to them, the Gnostics, the Montanists, the early mystics, were cast as enemies of order. One voice, the Church said, one path, one shepherd. All else, heresy. And yet the fragments survived. Hidden in caves, sealed in jars, buried under centuries of silence. When the Nag Hammadi library was discovered, it cracked the narrative open just slightly, enough to show that the early Christian world was far from unified. It was plural, vibrant, conflicting. There was no single voice, until Rome insisted on one. And that insistence required not only faith, but force. The Inquisition did not begin in the shadows. It was public, methodical, sanctioned. A machinery of purity designed not just to punish dissent, but to erase it from memory. Trial records were kept in Latin inaccessible to the masses. Names were removed from history. Books vanished. Ideas were burned along with their authors. It is easy to think of this as medieval, distant, brutal, but no longer relevant. But the machinery never truly stopped. It only grew quieter. Today, when a theologian proposes a radical reading of Scripture, they are not burned. but they may be removed from their post, their writings denied publication, their ideas labeled non-binding or private revelation. The control remains gentler in form, but no less firm in outcome. The modern church does not erase with fire. It erases with silence. There is a small chapel in southern France, tucked between the hills near Rennes-le-Château. The legend says it was once home to a priest who uncovered a secret, a document hidden in the walls detailing a lineage that would shatter the church's claims to spiritual monopoly. He died wealthy suddenly and alone. The Vatican never commented. But the rumors endured. That Mary Magdalene fled to Gaul, that she bore a child, that the bloodline of Christ continued not in Rome's vaults, but in living flesh. It sounds like fiction, and perhaps it is. But why then has the Church worked so hard to discredit even the question, why does mythology frighten them? Unless it touches something real. Faith, we are told, should rest on mystery. Yet when mysteries arise outside sanctioned lines, they are not embraced. They are feared, contained, declared irrelevant. So we ask again, does God need an intermediary? Or does the intermediary need God to justify its own authority? There is a kind of loneliness in these questions, a silence the size of centuries. Because if the Church was never the only path, if the truth was larger than the institution, what then? Where do we go for meaning? For guidance, for belonging. It is not that the Church must be evil. That is too simple a frame. Institutions grow to protect, to structure, to endure. But in doing so, they also accumulate weight. And sometimes they forget what they were built around. Sometimes the shell survives, and the soul fades. So perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that the Vatican hides lies, but that it forgets what it cannot control. There are places even the keys cannot reach. There are truths that wait in silence, unguarded. And somewhere perhaps in a sealed drawer, or in the margins of a centuries-old book, a single sentence waits to be read again. Not because it changes everything, but because it reminds us that not everything can be kept, not even by those who speak in the name of God. Somewhere in northern Italy, deep in the folds of the Apennine Hills, sits a monastery no longer marked on most maps. The bell tower has long been silent. The walls covered in moss and rain stained with time lean slightly towards the earth, as if remembering something heavy. Inside, in a forgotten alcove once used for prayer, a fresco was found. Faded, cracked, but intact enough to disturb. It depicts a man bearded barefoot, holding no cross. Instead, he stands with a finger pressed to his lips, and around him robed figures kneel in a half-circle, not in reverence, but in fear. Below the image, an inscription reads in Latin, "He who truly listens needs no voice." The Vatican never authenticated the fresco. It was quietly acquired, archived, and never displayed. No official explanation was offered. But the implication lingers. What if silence was once sacred? What if the voice of God was meant to be heard within, not dictated without? The image unsettles not just because of what it shows, but because of what it threatens, the idea that revelation, true divine revelation, cannot be mediated, that the chain of command the Church so carefully preserves might be unnecessary, even obstructive. For centuries, the notion of unmediated truth has terrified religious institutions. Consider the mystics: Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, Meister Eckhart, visionaries, whose words did not always align with doctrine, but whose experiences could not be denied. They spoke of oneness of inner light of God, not as king or judge, but as presence, immediate, intimate, unbound by form. They did not claim titles. They asked no allegiance. Their authority came from experience, and that was dangerous. Some were excommunicated, others investigated. Still others, like Teresa of Avila, were only later canonized after careful selection and revision of their works. Their message was clear: the sacred is not distant. It pulses beneath the skin. But a church built on hierarchy cannot easily accommodate such intimacy. It requires order. Layers, a system in which divine truth flows downward from heaven to pope, to bishop, to priest, to people. Break that chain, and the entire structure trembles. So mystics were tolerated but monitored, their writings copied but corrected, their visions translated through official language. Any element that suggested God might reside fully in the individual outside of sacraments, outside of church walls, was softened or removed. Because if the divine is already here, already within, what becomes of those who claim to stand between? This fear of direct communion is not confined to Christianity. Across time, wherever institutions form around belief, intermediaries emerge, priests, oracles, prophets sanctioned by system, and invariably voices that claim a personal path to the sacred are labeled subversive or mad. Even Jesus in his time was such a voice. He challenged the temple. He taught on hillsides, in boats, in homes not behind stone altars. He wrote nothing down. He told stories. He placed healing above ritual, and perhaps most dangerously, he invited others to do the same. "You will do greater things than I," he said. How quickly we forget that promise. After his death, those who followed him began to argue over words, over meanings, over who had the right to speak in his name. The Gospels themselves reflect this struggle, not just records of events, but lenses shaped by communities already divided. And as the church grew, it chose certain voices: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But others were lost. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the dialogue of the Savior, texts that spoke of a different kind of knowing, less hierarchical, less definitive, sometimes feminine, sometimes plural. They didn't always offer answers. They offered invitation. Is it possible the earliest Christianity was never meant to be codified? Was the movement of Christ always destined to become an institution? Or did it once resist that fate? The early desert fathers, hermits who withdrew from the world, may have sensed this. They lived in silence, rejecting not just the empire, but the church's growing ambition. For them, holiness was found in emptiness, in listening. Their prayers were not formulas. Their wisdom was not taught through lectures. It was passed in glances, gestures, the hush of wind through barren stone. Their lives raised a question that still stirs. What is lost when faith is managed? There is a story unconfirmed but persistent of a cardinal in the 17th century who discovered an unauthorized manuscript hidden in the library of a convent. The text bore no title, no signature. It described a dream in which a great cathedral collapsed not from fire or war, but from a breath, a single exhale of truth whispered by a child who had never read a scripture. The manuscript vanished. Some say it was destroyed. Others believe it still exists somewhere in the forbidden vaults beneath the Vatican. Even now the breath remains. In quiet places, in forgotten corners of the world, people still listen for something that doesn't come from pulpits or councils, a stillness that is not silence, but presence, a sense that the divine doesn't speak with one voice and may not speak in words at all. So we return to the fresco, the barefoot man, the trembling listeners, the warning in paint. He who truly listens needs no voice. Was it painted by a heretic, a mystic, a monk who glimpsed something the church could not hold? We do not know. But the image remains flickering in the shadow between what is seen and what is kept. And the question lingers like incense in cold air. If truth can whisper, why have we been told to listen only to those who shout? There is a room beneath St. Peter's Basilica that few know exists. It is not listed on any map. It cannot be toured. It is said to be octagonal windowless and lined with shelves of sealed boxes, each marked with a number, no names. Inside those boxes, legend says, are prophecies, not of saints or scribes, but of those the church could not canonize, because to do so would be to admit. They were right. One box, according to whispered inventories, contains a parchment from the 12th century. The ink has faded to brown. The edges are torn. But the words, if true, would unravel something carefully preserved, a vision in which the Pope walks alone in a crumbling city, his robes in flames while voices chant not prayers but questions, endless rising questions. The parchment ends with a sentence that is less a prophecy than a diagnosis. When the shepherd forgets the field, the wolves become priests. Who wrote these words? Why were they kept instead of destroyed, or were they kept because destruction would give them power? Throughout history, prophecy has both threatened and served the church. Some visions, those that affirm authority, are embraced, others are buried. But buried does not mean forgotten. Some truths are too potent to destroy, too inconvenient to allow, so they are hidden in plain sight, encased in ritual, stripped of their original fire. Take, for example, the story of the third secret of Fatima. In 1917, 3 children in Portugal claimed to see the Virgin Mary. She gave them visions, 3 secrets passed in hushed tones and trembling hands. The first 2 were released by the Church in the decades that followed. They spoke of war of Russia, of repentance. But the third was sealed. Decades passed. Rumors grew. Some said it foretold the collapse of the Vatican. Others said it spoke of infiltration, that the Church would be overtaken from within, not by armies, but by men wearing collars. When the Vatican finally released a version of the third secret in 2000, it described a bishop in white, walking through a ruined city, gunned down among corpses. Symbolic, they said. But not everyone believed them. Cardinal Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI, hinted that the text might not be complete, that there were elements too complex, too disturbing to include. A pause, a silence. What is more disturbing than the death of a pope, unless it is the death of trust, the collapse of legitimacy? What if the true prophecy was never about blood, but about betrayal, not from enemies, but from within? The idea that the Church could be compromised from inside is not new. Even Scripture tells of Judas. Even early councils spoke of corruption. But modern believers are taught to see the Vatican as a moral center, perhaps flawed, perhaps human, but still sacred. A compass. But what happens when the compass spins? In the 1970s, a Jesuit priest named Malachi Martin claimed to have read the full third secret. He said it involved a great apostasy beginning at the top, that the institution would present itself as unchanged, but inside something essential would rot. Not dogma, not buildings, but soul. He was discredited, quietly, but never fully refuted. And this raises a troubling idea. What if the Church itself has become the test? Not the solution to spiritual crisis, but the terrain in which it unfolds. The people still come, still kneel, still light candles and whisper prayers. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes there is a hollowness in the ritual, a sense that the motion remains, but the meaning has drifted. The gold gleams, but the silence inside the tabernacle grows louder. A question forms beneath the incense and marble. Does God still dwell here? Or has he stepped outside waiting? This is not an accusation. It is a wondering. A gentle, trembling wondering that lives in the hearts of many clergy and laity alike, but is rarely spoken aloud. Because to ask it is to risk seeing the cracks. And yet cracks are where the light begins. There are stories, quiet, undocumented, of priests who saw things they could not explain. A Mass where the Eucharist vanished before consecration. A voice in an empty confessional asking for forgiveness in a language no one had spoken in centuries. Statues that wept not blood, but ink. Letters appearing in ancient script written on the walls of chapels closed for generations. Hoaxes, perhaps. But why does the Church investigate in secret? Why are the results sealed, rarely published? And what are they protecting, faith or control? Prophecies are dangerous not because they predict doom, but because they suggest possibility. A future not yet written. A path diverging from tradition. That kind of power, the power to imagine alternatives, is unsettling to institutions built on permanence. Yet the gospel is full of reversals. The last shall be first, the meek shall inherit, the temple will be torn down. So why should the Church be immune? Perhaps the question is not what does the Vatican hide, but rather, what can it no longer bear to reveal? A document in a sealed room, a vision never released, a sentence written by candlelight and never meant to be read. All these things point not to conspiracy, but to fragility. Not a machine of oppression, but a structure grown too heavy for its own walls. And in that fragility lies something almost beautiful, because what breaks can also open. What cracks can also breathe. But only if we are willing to look, willing to ask, and to listen not just to those investments, but to the silence beneath them. There is a corridor beneath the Apostolic Palace, long abandoned and rarely spoken of, known among archivists only as La Via Morta, the Dead Way. Its purpose is unclear. No official blueprint includes it. The walls are unmarked, bare of ornament. But along its ceiling, carved into the stone so faintly that it disappears in most light, is a phrase repeated over and over in Latin. Quod non licet scire non licet existere. What cannot be known must not exist. A warning, a decree, or simply a reflection of how the Vatican has survived for centuries. To protect faith by managing knowledge. The Church has always walked a careful line between revelation and concealment. It offers mysteries, the Trinity, the Eucharist, the resurrection, but wraps them in doctrine. Not to answer questions, but to contain them. The paradox must remain intact, but not unguarded. And so, over time, mystery became regulation. Wonder became hierarchy. And truth became property. It did not start with malice. Perhaps it never does. The early church needed cohesion. Heresies threatened unity. Dissent splintered believers. So decisions had to be made. Councils convened, gospels selected, writings destroyed, boundaries drawn. It was an act of survival, spiritual and political. The truth was not just divine. It had to be administrable. But the cost of control is always the same for getting what was not chosen. The Apocrypha, the lost books. The texts labeled pseudepigrapha, falsely attributed, said the church and therefore dangerous. Among them, the Book of Enoch, once widely read, quoted in the Epistle of Jude, revered by early Christians, now almost unknown. Why? Because it describes angels who fall not from pride, but from love. Angels who teach humans forbidden knowledge, astronomy, metallurgy, healing. A version of the sacred that empowers rather than humbles. A God who punishes not sin, but curiosity. Uncomfortable material for an institution built on obedience. And yet the text persists. Copied by monks in Ethiopia, whispered among the early desert mystics, preserved in shadows, not destroyed, only denied, which raises a question that has no easy answer. What else has been denied? In 1999, a Jesuit researcher named Father Luigi Marinelli published a book titled Gone with the Wind in the Vatican. It was anonymous, filled with accusations, corruption, blackmail, secret factions. The Vatican dismissed it as slander, but the author was never sued. And some of the claims over time proved eerily accurate. Marinelli spoke of two churches, the visible one built on marble and Latin, and the invisible one composed of silence, pressure, and fear. He did not accuse the church of disbelief, only of forgetting why it believed. There is power in remembering, and danger, because when the past reappears through discovery, through archaeology, through accident, it challenges what has been curated. In 2012, a set of scrolls surfaced in Jordan bound in lead etched in Aramaic. Some scholars believed they contained early Christian imagery, possibly even the earliest mention of Christ. The Vatican remained silent, then quietly intervened to recover the scrolls. Why? Were they fakes? Or did they say something the church wasn't ready to hear? No answers were given, only absence. And in that absence, speculation thrives. Some believe the Vatican's greatest secret is not a book or a relic or even a vault. It is a choice made long ago to place the needs of the institution above the needs of revelation, to preserve the church even if that meant sacrificing the wild, ungovernable truths of early faith. Because wildness cannot be regulated. It cannot be canonized. And yet it was there at the beginning, in the upper rooms, the deserts, the tombs. It was there in Mary's unanswered questions, in Peter's fear, in Thomas's doubt. The gospel was never clean. It was raw, uncertain human. But uncertainty does not build cathedrals. So over time the rawness was polished, the stories were edited, and the divine became manageable. Predictable, safe, until it wasn't. Until the voices began to rise again, not in rebellion, but in wondering. Why are the archives sealed? Why is access so rare? Why does the church, which claims to guard the light, keep so much in darkness? The official answer is always the same: protection, preservation, context. Some materials, they say, require trained interpretation. Others may confuse or scandalize. Still others are incomplete. But who decides what is too dangerous to know? Who decides which questions we are allowed to ask? Somewhere in the Vatican, there are boxes that haven't been opened in 500 years, their contents logged but unread, sealed by decree, too sensitive, too sacred, too fragile, not because they would destroy faith, but because they might shift it, tilt it slightly, reframe it just enough to loosen the grip of those who hold the keys. And that is the real fear. Not chaos, not heresy, but freedom. Freedom to encounter the divine without mediation. Freedom to read the texts that didn't make the cut. Freedom to believe that truth might still be unfinished. So we return to the phrase etched above the dead way. What cannot be known must not exist. But what if that's wrong? What if the unknown is not a threat, but an invitation? What if the greatest heresy is not in asking questions, but in refusing to hear the answers? There was a ritual once, now erased, in which no words were spoken. No priest stood before the people, no incense, no bells, no altar. Just a circle of believers gathered under starlight, barefoot on earth, holding stones in their palms. They would stand in silence for the span of 7 breaths. Then they would place the stones down and walk away. The church deemed it pagan. No record remains of what it meant. Only a marginal note in a condemned manuscript written by a monk who dared to ask, "Is it not worship to listen to the breath of God in silence?" The manuscript is now lost, but the question survives. Long before the Vatican claimed authority over sacraments, rites like this existed fleeting, intimate, rooted in land, body, sky. They left little behind. No creeds, no doctrines, only echoes. And yet when traced through whispers in early texts, through gestures carved into forgotten chapels, through fragments of banned liturgies, something ancient stirs, something the Church once knew and then unlearned. It is easy to forget that Christianity was not born with structure. It had no roadmap. It grew in hidden places, adapted, borrowed. In the early centuries, believers met in caves, forests, bathhouses, even graveyards. Their worship was improvisational. Their truths embodied, not dictated. There were rituals for mourning that involved wrapping the body in herbs, while singing psalms not found in any Bible. There were birth blessings performed by women passed down orally, never written. There were fasts held not by calendar, but by moonlight. And there were teachings gentle, luminous, that said the divine could be touched in all things, not just the Eucharist. In bread baked by a mother, in tears shed beside a dying friend, in the shadows between prayers. The Church over time called these practices unorthodox, then dangerous, then forgotten. Because once a religion becomes an institution, it must define itself not just by what it includes, but by what it excludes. And so the exclusions began. At first they were small, a phrase omitted here, a chant altered there. But as centuries passed, the omissions grew larger. Doctrines hardened, hierarchies thickened, and slowly the mystery was fenced. Not eliminated, just enclosed, so that it could be managed. Among the texts banned during the early ecumenical councils was a liturgy known only as the Meal Without Fire. No full copy remains. Only a description survives, preserved in the writings of a 3rd century bishop, who warned that this ritual bypassed the priesthood entirely, that it allowed common people to bless their own gatherings, that it invoked not Christ as sacrifice, but as companion. He walks beside you, the liturgy was said to begin, not above. Such words were destabilizing. If Christ is beside you, then who stands above? If sanctity is shared, what becomes of control? So the ritual vanished, and the bishop who defended it, his name was struck from church records, his writings declared suspect, his tomb desecrated, even his memory exiled. Yet the trace remains, as it always does. Hidden beneath the Church's towering system is a layer of practices and prayers that once pulsed with warmth, breath closeness. Not heretical, just ungoverned. Not rebellious, just intimate. Expressions of faith that needed no permissions, no intermediaries. Faith that asked questions without fear. Faith that trusted silence. One such practice resurfaced in 1941 in the remote Alban Hills, where a shepherd discovered an ossuary tucked inside a hillside shrine. Inside were bones, yes, but also carvings. Symbols, a language no longer spoken but recognizable to certain scholars of proto-Christian worship. The patterns resembled a prayer cycle, 12 lines, repeating images of wind, wheat, firelight, and sleep. None of the words matched liturgy, but all of them invoked presence. The Vatican retrieved the ossuary. A statement was issued pagan artifacts of historical interest. The symbols were never translated. Not officially, but privately, a handful of theologians suggested that the phrases resembled a kind of cosmic Our Father, a meditation not on hierarchy, but on harmony. Not sin, but stillness. What happens to a church that no longer knows its own roots? What happens to a tree that cuts off its oldest rings? The modern Vatican is a marvel of preservation. Its libraries store tens of thousands of manuscripts. But access is controlled. Only vetted scholars. Only approved topics. Only certain questions. What if the most important knowledge cannot be filed? What if the Church has safeguarded so many relics that it has lost the breath behind them? This is not an accusation of conspiracy. That would be too easy, too crude. The truth, as always, is gentler and more unsettling. The Church may not be hiding secrets out of malice. It may simply have forgotten them. Truths too fluid for doctrine, rituals too soft for theology, gestures that could never be canonized, only lived. And in forgetting them, the institution calcified. Like clay once shaped by hand, now fired to stone. But memory has strange ways of returning. A carved phrase in a ruined chapel. A prayer scratched into wood. A dream passed down across centuries. And always the question lingering behind every forgotten rite. If the divine once walked beside us in silence, why have we built so many walls to speak for him? There is an old story, one the Church rarely tells, about a papal conclave that ended in silence. No smoke rose. No bells rang. The cardinals locked away beneath frescoed ceilings could not agree. Day after day, ballots were burned. Debates grew heated. But the votes did not change. Until at last, someone proposed something unthinkable. What if we do not choose? The silence that followed was deeper than the marble it echoed through. Not stunned silence, but stillness. As if a truth had entered the room, and no one dared name it. No one outside knows how long they sat like that. No name was ever released. No pope crowned. Officially, the conclave ended with a unanimous decision, but no record of the name chosen survives. Some say the man never accepted the role. Others say he left Rome entirely. And some say he listened to something the Church had forgotten how to hear. What if power is not meant to speak, but to pause? In the Christian tradition, God is often described through voice. And God said, begins the world. The prophets hear thunder whispers commands. The Gospels show Christ teaching, correcting, comforting with words. And the Church, inheriting that model, built itself on proclamation declarations, creeds, sermons. But beneath all the speaking was always the silence. The desert where Moses waited. The cave where Elijah heard nothing. And then a still small voice. The tomb sealed and heavy before dawn broke. And yet silence has always been the most threatening thing to institutions. Because silence cannot be managed. It cannot be quoted, published, or claimed. And it leaves too much room for questions. The Church filled that space quickly. Doctrine replaced mystery. Ritual replaced presence. And the stillness once revered as sacred became suspicious. Something to be filled. Liturgies expanded. Chants layered. Even the architecture changed, vaults and domes designed to amplify voice, not absorb it. But the earliest Christians met in silence. They sat together without structure, waiting not for authority, but for presence. The Quakers centuries later would echo this instinct. They believed God could speak through anyone or no one, that a gathering could be entirely silent if that was what the Spirit asked. This terrified more traditional churches. Where was the structure? The leadership? The certainty? But maybe certainty was never the point. Maybe silence is not the absence of God, but the space where He waits to be found. In the 15th century, a nun named Marguerite Porret wrote of the soul's annihilation not in despair, but in surrender. A falling away of ego, of language, of even prayer. She described a union with the divine so deep, so unmediated, that the Church declared it blasphemy. She was burned. Her writings were buried. But a few copies survived, hidden in libraries, copied in secret, passed down by those who sensed there was truth in the silence. And what does it mean that her silence was feared more than speech? The Church has always guarded against what it cannot explain. That is not cruelty. It is instinct. Institutions by nature defend themselves. They codify what once was fluid. But in doing so, something is always lost. There is a chapel in Prague, now closed, where monks once practiced a ritual of silence known as the empty hour. It was not prayer, not meditation. It had no structure at all. The monks simply gathered at sunset, extinguished every candle, and waited. They believed God entered only when all attempts at control had ceased. The Church eventually forbade the rite. Too ambiguous, too open, too easily misunderstood. But perhaps the misunderstanding was the point. Not everything needs to be understood. Some things are only meant to be encountered. Mystics throughout history, from Christian to Sufi to Buddhist, have spoken of the great unknowing, a place beyond words, beyond even belief, where one no longer seeks to explain God, but to experience Him. It is a place the Church rarely visits, not because it denies it, but because it cannot administer it. And yet the ache for that place is everywhere. In the weariness of priests who feel more like administrators than shepherds. In the restlessness of congregations who long for something beyond doctrine. In the quiet tears shed during Mass, not because of the homily, but because of a silence that slipped in between songs. It's as if something ancient still stirs beneath the marble, something not erased, only sleeping. And it raises a possibility, fragile, heretical, beautiful. What if the greatest act of faith is not to speak, but to wait in the dark, to wait without answers, to let the silence stretch and deepen and hollow out the soul until all that's left is listening. Not to a voice from the pulpit, not to a creed on a page, but to something vast and slow and wordless. In the catacombs of Domitilla, one of the oldest Christian burial sites in Rome, there is a fresco unlike the others. It shows no saints, no crosses, only a circle of people, sitting, their eyes closed, their hands open. Beneath them, faded but still legible, is a line. In silence, the beginning and the end. The Vatican has never commented on this image. Perhaps it is too simple, or too threatening, because a church that listens may find truths it cannot contain, and a church that pauses may find that the voice of God has moved on without it. So the question returns, quiet as breath. What if holiness was never meant to be spoken at all? What if the most sacred thing is the silence we've been taught to fear? There is a bone in a glass case in a basilica in Cologne. It is said to be the finger of a saint, though which one has changed with the centuries. First it belonged to Matthew, then Thomas. Now it's labeled only Sanctus Ignotus, the unknown saint. Pilgrims still come. They kneel, they weep, they press their palms to the glass, whispering prayers meant for no one in particular, and still the finger remains, pale, curved slightly inward as if pointing, not to heaven, not to God, but perhaps to the lie. Relics are among the Church's oldest treasures: bones, cloth, hair, teeth, drops of blood, splinters of the cross, the veil of Mary, the foreskin of Christ, hundreds, thousands of sacred fragments enshrined, catalogued, adored. They form a quiet second theology, a faith in matter, in the touch of holiness, in proximity to the divine. But how many of them are real? And does it matter? During the Middle Ages, there were more pieces of the true cross than could possibly come from a single tree, more nails than could ever have held one body. At one point, there were at least 4 separate skulls of John the Baptist, all venerated, all defended. Pilgrims traveled for months to see these objects. They carried coins to buy indulgences. They left offerings, confessions, locks of their own hair. They believed that holiness could be stored like fire in a stone. And the Church let them believe, because relics are powerful, not just spiritually but socially, politically. A relic draws people. People draw money. Money builds cathedrals. The bones of a saint are worth more than gold, not for what they are, but for what they promise access. Mediation. A glimpse of the eternal reduced to something you can kiss. But beneath every reliquary is a question. Who decides what is holy? There is no divine fingerprint on a bone, no heavenly watermark on a shroud. Authenticity depends on narrative, on belief repetition, and the silent agreement not to look too closely. In 1903, during an internal Vatican audit of relics, a box was discovered in a Roman convent. It contained a piece of parchment, a stone, and a small vial of darkened fluid. The parchment claimed the vial held the tears of the Virgin Mary, gathered somehow during the flight into Egypt. There was no explanation of how such a thing could survive. No seal, no verification. It was quietly removed, placed into storage, and never mentioned again. There are countless such stories, forgotten fragments with impossible claims, nails that never rust, bread that never molds, cloth that changes color under moonlight. Some are frauds, some are symbols, But a very few, are left unexplained. And the Vatican does not destroy them. It stores them. Deep in the reliquary vaults, far from public view, there are items labeled not by saint, but by silence. Their names erased, their provenance unclear, not banned, not burned, just withdrawn. It is as if the Church does not know what to do with these relics, as if they resist categorization, as if they carry a charge not of holiness, but of memory. Memory of a time before the Church claimed ownership over the sacred. Because once long ago, relics were not property, they were messages, fragments of the world touched by something larger. They were passed from hand to hand, unsealed, unnamed, kept in pockets, wrapped in cloth, buried with the dead. They were not displayed, they were carried, and in being carried they remained alive. Now they are encased in gold, bolted to marble, guarded by security systems, their power domesticated. But power does not disappear, it waits, and every now and then it slips through the cracks. In 1987, a reliquary in southern Spain was said to bleed. A drop appeared on the glass. Then another. Local authorities called for investigation. The Church responded cautiously. A commission was formed. Samples were taken. The results, according to internal documents, were inconclusive. The reliquary was removed. Its chapel closed. The blood, if it was blood, was never explained. And yet pilgrims still come to the empty chapel. They light candles outside the locked doors. They press their ears to the stone, not because they expect answers, but because they remember something that once moved. Relics are not just bones. They are stories. And stories like faith become dangerous when they refuse to die. The Vatican knows this. That is why the reliquary archives are not only guarded, they are censored. Not every relic is included in public inventories. Some are listed under false names. Others are marked non-exhibere, not for display. But why? If they are fake, why keep them? If they are holy, why hide them? Unless their holiness lies not in what they prove, but in what they question. Perhaps the greatest relics are not objects at all. Perhaps they are thresholds, points where the human and the divine once brushed too briefly to explain too powerfully to forget. And when the Church tries to contain them, they resist. Because truth like bone cannot be bent forever. Eventually it breaks. Or reveals. So we return to the finger and the glass case. Pointing, always pointing. Not to a miracle, not to a doctrine, but maybe to something behind us, something buried, something we were never meant to find, and yet cannot stop seeking. Every clock in the Vatican runs just a fraction fast. It's imperceptible, mere seconds, but enough that over time, the rhythm of the smallest sovereign state on earth pulses slightly ahead of the world around it. Some say it's symbolic, a gesture toward divine order. Others say it's practical. But no official explanation has ever been given. Only this quiet insistence that Rome moves slightly before the rest of us. It might seem trivial, but time, when controlled, becomes sacred. And the Vatican, more than any empire, has shaped how the world measures its days. The calendar we live by, Gregorian, was born from the Church. Introduced in 1582 by Pope Gregory XIII, it corrected a flaw in the Julian calendar. The seasons had drifted. Easter was arriving too late. The equinox no longer aligned with the rituals. So the Church stepped in, not just to adjust clocks, but to realign reality. 10 days were removed. October 4th became October 15th. Entire lives vanished from record marriages, births, debts, deaths erased by decree. And the people obeyed. Because when the church says time must shift, time shifts. But not everyone accepted the new calendar. Some countries waited years, others centuries. The Russian Orthodox Church didn't switch until after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Greek Church resisted even longer. And in the cracks between calendars, uncertainty grew. What year is it really? What day? And who decides? The Church has always positioned itself not just as guardian of the soul, but steward of time. Feast days, fasting periods, holy years, jubilee cycles, the rhythm of salvation mapped onto the sun and moon, sacred chronology. But chronology is not neutral. It is a structure, a story. And whoever writes the story of time writes the story of truth. Before the Gregorian reform, other systems competed for authority. The Hebrew calendar, the Islamic lunar cycle, the Byzantine reckoning, which began not at the birth of Christ, but at the supposed date of creation, 559 BC. All of them proposed a vision of history, a center, a meaning. But the Church's calendar triumphed. And in that triumph, something was lost. Because in creating one timeline, others had to be buried. Old reckonings, forgotten festivals, ancient rhythms now labeled pagan, the lunar traditions of early Christian sects, the solar temples aligned with solstice, the mystery schools that saw time not as linear, but as spiral. The Church declared these false, primitive, dangerous. But what if they were simply different? There are stone circles in Ireland that predate Christianity by thousands of years. Their builders tracked solstices with perfect precision. They marked not just agricultural cycles, but spiritual thresholds, moments when the veil between worlds grew thin. Light piercing dark, stillness turning toward motion. When missionaries arrived, they built chapels on these sites, not beside them, on them, layer upon layer, until the original purpose was obscured, but the stones remain, and the shadows still fall where they always did. Which raises a question: did the Church sanctify these times and places, or silence them? The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD didn't just debate theology. It also set the date of Easter. A compromise, a control, because people had been celebrating it at different times in different ways. Some by the full moon, some by the equinox, some by both. The council imposed order. One resurrection, one formula, one authority. And ever since Easter has floated through our calendar, a ghostly feast that never quite settles. Calculated with astronomical precision, but still whispered about like a mystery. The Vatican Observatory, founded in the late 16th century, continues this work. From Castel Gandolfo, astronomers track the heavens not just for science, but for sacred scheduling. And while their findings are published, their ultimate purpose remains quiet. To keep the Church in sync with the cosmos it once feared. Because for much of history, the stars were both map and menace. Astrology, now dismissed, was once a tool of priests. Charts drawn not to predict love or wealth, but to mark divine moments. The Magi followed a star. The Gospels speak of signs in the sky. But somewhere along the way, the stars were demoted. The Church no longer needed omens. It had a calendar, a fixed truth. And yet, even fixed truths shift. In 2006, a small team of researchers proposed that Christ may have been born not in December, but in June based on planetary alignments and historical census data. The Vatican declined to comment. Because Christmas isn't about accuracy, it's about rhythm, control, the continuation of a cycle older than Bethlehem. Winter solstice, light returning. And the Church knows this, it has always known. Its feasts wrap around solstices, equinoxes, harvests. It absorbs, adapts, reassigns. The goddess becomes the virgin. The oak king becomes Saint Nicholas. The bonfire becomes Pentecost flame. This is not deceit, it's survival. But in the layering, something original fades. And sometimes what fades remembers. There are villages in southern France that still mark the day between years, an unofficial feast unrecognized by any liturgical calendar. It falls between December 31st and January 1st, a space they say outside of time. A crack in the clock. A night for dreams. No mass is said, no bells are rung. Only silence. Only candles placed at thresholds. And in that quiet space, a different sense of time returns, one that does not belong to empires or councils or clocks. Just breath, just darkness, just the possibility that not all time has been claimed. So we return to the Vatican's fast clocks, not broken, not sinister, just ahead, but perhaps not ahead of the world, only ahead of itself, because in trying to master time, to bind it to dogma and decree, the Church may have forgotten what time is. Not a line, not a ledger, but a mystery. One we do not control. One we only walk through barefoot and blinking as the stars continue their slow, silent turn. There's a passport that grants its bearer access to nearly every country on Earth. No questions, no searches, no stamps. It is small crimson and embossed with gold. It belongs not to a nation, but to a city-state so small you can walk across it in 20 minutes. The passport is issued by the Vatican, and it has no expiration date. Only a few hundred people hold it. Cardinals, diplomats, envoys, priests whose missions extend beyond the pulpit. They move freely across borders under the protection of something older than politics and more complex than religion. Because the Vatican is not just a church, it is a state, a sovereign entity with embassies, ambassadors, treaties, and power. Not the kind of power seen in armies or weapons, but something subtler. The power of immunity, the power of silence, the power to remain outside while moving inside. How did this happen? How did a religious institution come to possess the privileges of a nation? The answer begins in 1929 with the Lateran Treaty, an agreement between the Holy See and Mussolini's Italy. After centuries of conflict over papal territories, a compromise was reached. The Vatican would cede its claims to the Italian peninsula, and in return, it would be recognized as an independent state. Just 109 acres, but sovereign, untouchable. From that moment forward, the Vatican was not merely spiritual, it was political. It could sign concordats. It could negotiate with governments. It could send diplomats into war zones. And it could shield its own from arrest, from scrutiny, from accountability. Over time, this immunity hardened. Today, the Vatican maintains diplomatic relations with over 180 countries. Its representatives attend United Nations assemblies, speak at the World Health Organization, and influence international law, all while operating under the banner of moral authority. But moral authority is difficult to measure. What happens when a representative of the Vatican commits a crime? What happens when a priest stationed in another country is accused not of sin, but of something criminal? In many cases, nothing, because extradition is almost impossible. Because the priest, by virtue of his position, is not simply clergy, but diplomat. The Vatican investigates internally, quietly, slowly, sometimes for years. And the outcomes are rarely made public. In a few rare instances, cooperation occurs, but most often the matter is resolved behind walls. Walls that do not answer questions. Walls that outlast empires. There is an office within the Vatican known as the Secretariat of State. It oversees not theology, but diplomacy. Behind its doors, treaties are drafted, sanctions discussed, aid distributed. It is the Vatican's beating political heart, and its power does not come from tanks or taxes, but from tradition. When the Pope speaks, nations listen. Not because they must, but because the Church has embedded itself into the consciousness of the world as something beyond reproach. An older voice. A neutral voice. But what does neutrality mean in a world of suffering? The Vatican has been both silent and outspoken, depending on the era, the Pope, the politics. It remained largely silent during the early years of Nazi Germany. It later spoke forcefully against communism. It has brokered peace talks and blessed regimes. It has sheltered dissidents and protected fugitives. Its neutrality, then, is not absence. It is strategy. And strategy by nature is selective. In 2014, a whistleblower within the Vatican leaked documents revealing covert investments in luxury real estate. Millions moved through offshore accounts. Donations, it seemed, had been used to acquire assets not to feed the poor, but to maintain wealth. The Vatican responded with internal reforms. A commission was formed. Audits were promised. But years later, much remains unclear. Files were sealed. Trials held in closed rooms. Those involved were reassigned or quietly retired. The system endures, not because it is flawless, but because it is shielded. Shielded by sovereignty, by ritual, by the centuries-long assumption that the Church must remain above the fray. But no one is above the fray. And even marble cracks. There is a corridor in the Apostolic Palace, where portraits of past popes line the walls, each face serene, regal, timeless. But none of them speak, none of them confess, and behind their painted eyes lies a truth the Church will never announce. That power once gained must be managed, even holy power, even power that began with a man walking barefoot through Galilean dust. Because the Church was not born a state, it became one, and in becoming one, it learned the costs of survival. The compromises, the negotiations, the necessary forgetting. Perhaps this was inevitable. Perhaps no institution can last for 2 millennia without absorbing the world it tries to transcend. But somewhere under the robes and rituals, under the stained glass and Latin chants, is a question still breathing. Can a church that functions like a state still serve the soul? Can diplomacy and divinity live in the same chamber? Or has one silenced the other? Some say the Vatican's sovereignty protects it. Others say it isolates it. But maybe it imprisons it. Because when a church becomes a country, it must guard borders. And when it guards borders, it must decide who to keep out and who to keep in. There is a door beneath the Apostolic Palace that few ever pass through. It bears no sign, no ornament. Only a lock, centuries old, forged in a time when knowledge was chained to silence. Behind that door lies one of the most secretive collections on earth the Vatican Apostolic Archive. It was once called the Secret Archive, not because its contents were hidden, but because they belonged to the Pope. Archivum Secretum, Apostolicum, Vaticanum, the personal records of the pontiff stretching back more than 1,000 years. And yet much of it has never been read. Shelves upon shelves, miles of manuscripts, letters between popes and emperors, reports from inquisitions, unpublished gospels, maps of vanished kingdoms, warnings, dreams, confessions. No index reveals it all. No catalog is complete. Only fragments, only echoes, and a silence more profound than any doctrine. The Vatican insists the archive is not secret, only restricted. Scholars may apply for access. A handful are admitted each year, but not everything is available. Documents are withheld, redacted, or simply marked non-consultabile, not available for consultation. No reason given, no appeal permitted. What are they protecting? And from whom? The Church has always seen itself as a steward of knowledge. It preserved texts when empires fell. It copied manuscripts by candlelight while cities burned. It maintained continuity in the dark. But preservation is not the same as revelation. To keep a book safe, is not to share it. Sometimes to preserve is also to prevent. There are whispers of what remains sealed. Letters from Galileo more defiant than regretful. A lost gospel attributed to Mary Magdalene rejected not for heresy, but for its silence on sin. A manuscript describing the crucifixion from the perspective of a Roman physician who saw not divinity, but something he couldn't name. There are reports from missionaries in South America who claimed to find Christian symbols in pre-Columbian temples. A sealed account of a 15th century astronomer who declared that the stars were not fixed, but moving long before such claims were safe to make. A 13th century papal edict never published calling for a review of the Book of Revelation. Too much, too early, too far from control. The archive does not deny these items exist. It simply does not confirm. And yet for centuries popes have passed through its halls, alone, reading what others cannot, sitting before parchments that suggest alternate paths, roads the Church could have taken, but did not. What does that do to a soul? To see the truths that were buried, to know the weight of choices that shaped 1 billion lives. Perhaps this is why access is so carefully limited, not to protect the past, but to protect the present. Because the archive does not just contain knowledge. It contains counter-narratives, evidence of early Christianities that diverged, accounts of miracles that contradict doctrine, documents that reveal not lies, but complexities, spaces where certainty wavers. And certainty is the Church's strongest pillar. There is, for example, a folio described only as Codex 2341b. It has never been photographed. Its contents are unknown to the public. But its existence is referenced in internal correspondence, enough to suggest that it contains writings from a mystic who claimed direct communion with Christ outside the sacraments. Some say it is a hoax. Others say it's one of the purest expressions of early Christian experience. But either way, it remains unread, because once read, it cannot be unread. And this is the Vatican's quiet dilemma. To open the archive is to invite transformation. To keep it closed is to confess fear. In 2002, under increasing public pressure, a portion of the archive was opened documents related to the Church's actions during World War II. Some were mundane, others raised new questions. A telegram unsigned warned of mass arrests in Eastern Europe. its delivery date 1 week before silence. And still the archive offers no explanation. Only more pages and more locks. There are rooms within the archive said to be temperature-controlled, not for preservation, but for privacy. A sealed chamber known as the Tower, not because it rises, but because it is isolated. No guards, no windows, only light triggered by presence. What lies inside? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps something that once mattered and no longer does. But even absence is powerful, because history is shaped not only by what is written, but by what is withheld. The Church understands this better than any institution. It does not lie. It curates. It selects. It offers what is deemed beneficial and protects what is not yet ready. But ready for whom? And who decides? There are scholars who dream of opening every shelf, archivists who speak in reverent tones about the unread, a generation of believers who long to know not just what happened, but what almost happened. Because within the archive lies the shadow of every truth we were never taught. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. And so we ask, what would happen if the doors opened? If every scroll, every letter, every record was laid bare? Would the Church fall? Would faith crumble? Or would something else emerge? Not doubt, but depth. A recognition that truth is not a single line, but a tapestry frayed at the edges. And perhaps the archive is not a vault. Perhaps it is a mirror, waiting for someone brave enough to look. Somewhere in the heart of the Vatican stands a statue no one speaks about. It is neither on display nor catalogued in any public archive. It rests in a vaulted chamber beneath St. John Lateran, the oldest papal basilica, older even than St. Peter's. The statue is carved of black stone, its features worn smooth by time and touch. It does not bear a cross. It does not resemble Christ. But still, it is said to radiate something sacred or unsettling. No inscription. No record of its commissioning. Only a name passed down in whispers, il silenzioso. The Silent One. Visitors are not allowed in the chamber. Even most clergy have never heard of it. Only a few archivists and curators acknowledge its existence, and even then only after long silence. Who is this figure, and why was it hidden? The Church is built on symbols, images, gestures. Every altar, every vestment, every stained glass window speaks in metaphor. Even the rituals themselves, baptism, communion, confirmation, are layered with meanings, visible and invisible. But symbols can become unruly. They accumulate history, layers of belief, forgotten origins, and sometimes what was once sacred becomes ambiguous. The Vatican understands this. It curates symbols as carefully as it curates doctrine. Statues are approved, icons replicated, paintings commissioned to reflect precise theological messages. Nothing is arbitrary, nothing without purpose. Which is why the unexplained statue beneath St. John Lateran matters. It is not part of any known tradition. It predates the Renaissance, possibly even Constantine. Its posture-seated head, slightly bowed hands, resting on knees, resembles not Christian saints, but something older, something reminiscent of ancient mystery cults. Mithras or Isis or something nameless. Some believe it was once venerated in secret, a relic of a time when Christianity had not yet separated itself fully from the world it inherited. Others suggest it was a warning, a representation of heresy meant to be hidden rather than destroyed. And still others whisper that it is a symbol of the Church itself, silent, watchful, unknowable. There is no proof, only presence. And presence, when unexplained, becomes its own kind of theology. For centuries, the Church has both embraced and controlled visual language. It knew early on what power an image holds. When most people could not read, it was the statue, not the scripture, that taught them who God was. The halo, the keys, the bleeding heart. These images became doctrine before words could. And yet, there were always tensions. In the 8th century, the iconoclast controversy nearly tore the Church apart. In Constantinople, statues and icons were smashed, burned, banned. The argument that God cannot be depicted, that any attempt to do so was idolatry, that the divine must remain invisible. Rome disagreed. The Western Church embraced imagery not as depiction, but as pathway, a way for the faithful to approach mystery. But even then, lines had to be drawn. Some images were approved, others quietly removed. There are mosaics buried beneath later layers of churches erased not by time, but by policy. Faces of female apostles, angels with no wings, crucifixions without suffering, each one suggesting a version of faith that did not fit the growing narrative. Because images do not only reflect belief, they shape it. And when belief must be uniform, images must be controlled. This is why the Vatican has an entire department devoted to sacred art. Not just to commission new works, but to evaluate old ones, to decide which images remain in circulation and which are retired. What does it mean to retire an icon? What happens when a symbol no longer serves the institution? In 1965, a painting was quietly removed from a chapel in northern Italy. It showed Christ seated, tired, laughing. Not triumphant, not glowing, just human. The image was based on a vision claimed by a local nun. The people loved it, but the bishop disagreed. Too casual, too uncertain. The painting now rests in storage, covered, unnamed. But the memory of it lingers, because people do not forget how it made them feel. And this is the risk of imagery. It bypasses doctrine. It enters through the heart, not the mind. A statue can say more than a sermon. A single gesture, a hand, a look, a shadow can awaken something no text can contain. Which brings us back to the silent one. Why was it hidden? Not destroyed, not explained, just placed in the dark. Perhaps because it said something the Church was not ready to hear. Or perhaps because it reminds us of what we've forgotten. That before there were creeds, there were symbols. Before there were doctrines, there were shapes in the dark. Before God was named, he was imagined. Not as king, not as judge, but as presence. Still, silent, watching. And perhaps waiting. There are rumors that the statue has been moved, that it now resides deeper underground, that some believe it is not just a relic, but a prophecy, a figure meant to be seen only when the Church is ready to listen again. But ready for what? For silence, for ambiguity, for a God who does not answer in words. No one knows. But in a church built on images, what cannot be shown is often the most important thing of all. And the silent one remains. Not speaking, not revealing, just being, as if to ask, what truths cannot be painted? What holiness cannot be held? There is a book in the Vatican library no one has read in over 500 years. Not because it is forbidden, not because it is lost, but because no one remembers how. It is written in a language unknown to modern scholars, not Latin, not Greek, not Aramaic. Its script is fluid, looping, precise. Its illustrations show no saints, no crosses, no familiar scenes. Only stars, plants that don't exist, and human figures standing in rings of fire, eyes closed. The spine bears no title. The catalog number ends in a cross. Some archivists refer to it simply as lingua deserta, the deserted tongue. The Vatican will not say where it came from, only that it has always been there, passed down, moved from shelf to shelf, studied once, then ignored. Now it sits in a temperature-controlled room too fragile to touch, too mysterious to discard. Who wrote it? What does it say? And why was it kept? The Church is built on language. It was words that shaped it. Words spoken, written, translated, codified. From the scrolls of the prophets to the letters of Paul. From the creeds of Nicaea to the catechism in every Catholic school. But language is not static. It lives, breathes, forgets, and sometimes it becomes dangerous. In the early centuries, Christians spoke many tongues: Greek, Coptic, Syriac, Latin. But over time, the Church narrowed its voice. Latin became the sacred language, the language of liturgy, law, and learning. Other voices were silenced, not just for clarity, but for control. Because if only the clergy understand the words, then only they control the meaning. For centuries, the Bible was read aloud in Latin, even when no one listening could understand. Sermons translated, yes, but the holy text remained locked. Not because the people were unworthy, but because ambiguity is threatening. A word can mean many things, and many things cannot be governed. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, it was not merely a religious act, it was revolutionary. He handed language back to the people, and with it the right to interpret, to question, to think. The Church responded with fire, and then with silence. Dozens of texts were placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. A list that grew with time, mystics, scientists, poets, visionaries, not because their words were false, but because they disrupted the script. Even now the legacy lingers. The index was officially abolished in 1966, but many of its books are still discouraged, still hard to find, still quietly unwelcome. And the Church still controls its canon, what may be read from the altar, what may be quoted in doctrine, what may be remembered. But language does not obey forever. In 1912, a monk cataloging medieval manuscripts in the Vatican Library found a text that defied categorization. Written in an unfamiliar alphabet, sentences structured like music, phrases that repeated but with subtle shifts like breath in prayer. He called it glossa spiritus, the gloss of the Spirit. Theologians dismissed it. No translation was ever made. But the monk claimed the text did something no other did. It made him dream, not of saints or judgment, but of sound, of echoes. He died before completing his study. His notes vanished. The text remains, untouched. But why would a church devoted to word in principio erat verbum preserve a book it cannot read? Unless it remembers a time when the word was not about understanding but presence. Not logic but wonder. Some languages were not made to explain, they were made to evoke. The ancient Hebrews knew this. the tetragrammaton. The sacred name of God was never spoken, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unspeakable. A breath, a pause, a mystery too deep for sound. Early Christians, too, wrote in symbols, fish loaves, anchors' eyes, not for secrecy, but for depth. The meaning was layered, living, known not through grammar, but through experience. But slowly the Church moved toward certainty, definitions, dogma, one meaning per word, one truth per sentence. And in that clarity, something dissolved. Mystics often wrote in what the Church called glossolalia tongues, streams of sound that broke grammar, defied syntax. Some said it was madness, others divine ecstasy, a language of the soul, not the mind. The Church accepted it briefly, then tamed it, defined it, regulated it. Because chaos, even holy chaos, is hard to preach. But language, when free, remembers. It remembers the voices lost at councils, the prayers once whispered in forgotten dialects, the Gospels never translated, the cries of those who believed differently and died for it. And perhaps the deserted tongue, lingua deserta, is one of those voices. Not a code, not a doctrine, but a remnant of a time when speaking to God meant not mastery, but surrender. There are rumors, quiet, unverifiable, that the deserted tongue appears elsewhere. On cave walls in Armenia, in the margins of illuminated manuscripts in Ireland, scratched into the base of a ruined chapel in Ethiopia. Always partial, always incomplete, as if it is trying to return, not to be understood, but to be felt. The Vatican keeps the book, preserved, indexed, untranslated. And perhaps in doing so it honors something older than orthodoxy, a truth that does not need to be spoken, only carried, only remembered, only heard. If we can learn to listen, beneath the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica, there is another city. It does not rise, it descends. A labyrinth of tombs, chambers, sealed corridors, names carved in Latin, sarcophagi stacked like quiet altars, frescoes that no longer have eyes. Down here the dead do not sleep. They wait. This place is called the Vatican necropolis. The official tour covers only a small path, the one that leads to what is believed to be the tomb of St. Peter. Visitors walk softly. Cameras are forbidden. The air is damp, ancient. Guides speak in low tones, as if trying not to wake something. But beyond the lit path are corridors not shown on maps, rooms without documentation, tombs without names. The Church says these areas are sealed for preservation. But preservation is not the same as forgetting. Who else lies buried beneath the basilica? Over the centuries, popes, cardinals, martyrs, and unknown figures have been interred here. Some were canonized, others were erased. A few only whispered about were buried without rites, without names, their tombs hidden behind false walls, their records altered or destroyed. Why? Because even in death, the narrative must be controlled. The Church teaches that death is not an end, but a passage. A mystery, yes, but a sacred one. Funerals are rituals of hope. Graves are signs of continuity. The Vatican, as both church and state, guards this passage carefully. But what happens when memory becomes threat? There are reports, rare, unofficial, of tombs removed under cover of darkness, bones quietly relocated, inscriptions scraped clean. not for heresy, not for scandal, but for ambiguity. Some of the dead do not fit the story. In the 19th century, construction beneath the basilica uncovered a series of sarcophagi arranged in a spiral. No markings, no crosses, only a symbol carved into each lid, a circle with a line through it like an eye closed in meditation. No records mention who they were. The Vatican reburied them. No public statement was made. Some researchers believe they belonged to an early sect Christians who believed the soul did not ascend but descended deeper into mystery. They rejected hierarchy. They left no texts, only bodies arranged like a question. And the Church has always feared questions without answers. There are legends of a forgotten pope elected in secret during a time of schism, whose name was struck from the records after only a few days. His tomb, it is said, lies beneath the crypt unmarked, not out of shame, but out of fear that his election would be remembered. Because to remember is to legitimize, and legitimacy in the realm of faith is everything. Even now, the Vatican guards its burials with precision. Only select figures are laid to rest beneath St. Peter's. Their tombs are choreographed, the position of the body, the materials used, the prayers spoken. It is theater, yes, but also liturgy, a way to script death. But not all who are buried there were saints. Not all who are remembered were holy. And not all who were holy are remembered. There are stories of mystics who died in the shadow of Rome. Women and men who saw visions, lived in silence, healed without recognition. Their bodies were not buried beneath marble, but in fields or caves or unmarked soil. And yet their memory lingers. Some say their spirits walk the corridors beneath the basilica, not as ghosts, but as questions. Who gets to be remembered? And why? The Church controls not just the keys of heaven, but the names of the dead. It canonizes selectively. It commemorates purposefully. And in doing so, it shapes the past not to deceive, but to preserve a version of truth that fits. But bones do not lie. They shift, they settle, they remain. There is a vault beneath the Vatican known only as Camera Oscura, the dark chamber. It is said to contain relics and remains deemed too ambiguous for display. Skulls with symbols carved inside, finger bones found in catacombs without corresponding saints, teeth wrapped in cloths that never decay. No public records confirm its existence, but some archivists say it is real. A repository of spiritual anomalies, holy misfits, proof that not all of God's witnesses wore robes or held titles. In 1963, a young seminarian working in the archives found a bundle of papers hidden in an unused reliquary box. The documents contained burial records from the 12th century, names and locations of monks buried secretly by their own brethren. The reason they had practiced a silent liturgy. No words, no hierarchy, just presence. The Vatican reclassified the papers as unverified. The seminarian left the priesthood. Sometimes the dead return, not in body, but in memory. A carved symbol resurfacing in a fresco. A name appearing in a forgotten hymn. A story told by candlelight, passed from mouth to mouth like breath. And sometimes even marble forgets its orders. In a corner of the Vatican necropolis behind a sealed gate, a wall has begun to crack. Not from water or time, but from pressure inside. A slab of stone shifts every few years, revealing briefly part of an inscription no one has been able to read. 3 words, in a script no longer used, always the same. Then the slab resets as if reluctant to reveal more. What is buried there? A body. A story. A truth the Church once needed to forget. Or perhaps it is not about forgetting at all. Perhaps it is about what the earth remembers when the Church does not. Because death is not silence, it is the echo that follows. And the deeper we go beneath the marble, beneath the narrative, the more clearly that echo speaks. Not in words, not in doctrine, but in presence. Waiting. There was a time when to study the stars was considered prayer. Before telescopes, before theories, before the heavens were mapped and measured, they were listened to. The early sky watchers, monks, mystics, scholars cloaked in robes, and silence believed that light spoke. That movement in the firmament was not just mathematics, but revelation. The Church once believed this too. In the Middle Ages, the Vatican housed some of the most advanced astronomical instruments in Europe. Sundials carved into cloister walls, manuscripts tracking eclipses with breathless precision, a kind of sacred astronomy not to control heaven, but to understand God's clockwork. Because to know the world was to honor the one who made it. But knowledge has a way of outrunning control, and over time curiosity became dangerous. Galileo is the name most remember, the man who turned a telescope to the stars and saw moons orbiting Jupiter phases on Venus, imperfections on the sun, things that could not be reconciled with Aristotle or with the Church's vision of the cosmos. In 1616 he was warned. In 1633 he was tried, forced to recant, forbidden to teach, imprisoned in his home for the remainder of his life. The Church later admitted it was wrong, but the damage had already been done. The stars had shifted, and something else, something less visible had been placed in orbit instead: fear. Not fear of science itself. The Vatican continued to study the heavens. In fact, it established its own observatory, first in Rome, then in Castel Gandolfo, and now in the mountains of Arizona. Jesuit astronomers still chart galaxies, supernovae, deep space phenomena, but they do so quietly, carefully, always beneath the shadow of doctrine. Because while the Church now says it embraces science, it embraces it with conditions. Truth must be compatible with Scripture, with tradition, with the frameworks already set in place. And anything that challenges those frames too directly, even today, is met not with fire, but with something more subtle: silence, delay, deflection. Consider evolution. The Vatican did not formally accept Darwinian evolution until the late 20th century. Even now, it stops short of endorsing its full implications. Human origins, the soul, the nature of consciousness. These remain cordoned off, unspoken, protected by a kind of intellectual no-fly zone. And yet, the questions persist. If humans evolved gradually, where in that arc does the soul enter? If we are stardust and code, what becomes of sin? If there was no Adam, no Eve, what does that mean for the fall? There are theologians who have explored these questions with great care. Scientists who are also priests. Priests who are also physicists. But rarely do their conclusions make it to the pulpit. They remain in footnotes, private seminars, dusty journals printed in small batches. Not because they are wrong, but because they are unsettling. Because they ask, what if the story is larger than we were told? And the Church, for all its majesty, has always struggled with largeness. It prefers systems, symbols, boundaries, definitions. Mystery, yes, but mystery contained. The Big Bang theory was proposed by a Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. At first, the Vatican welcomed it, a cosmic beginning. Let there be light. But when the implications expanded, multiverses, infinite regress, dark matter, the narrative grew hard to anchor. Because science, like faith, is a story. But it's a story without end. And the Church prefers endings. In 2008, the Vatican hosted a conference on astrobiology, the study of life beyond Earth. A remarkable gesture. Open-minded, forward-looking. But the statements made afterward were carefully worded. If alien life exists, it must also be part of God's creation. If it is intelligent, it too might need redemption. But what if it doesn't? What if there are beings who never fell, or who never knew what it meant to fall? And what if they have their own scriptures? The questions go unanswered, because there is a limit to how far the Church can stretch its scaffolding. Beyond a certain point, the architecture begins to sway. Cracks form in the marble. Echoes return louder than the voice. And still, the Church listens, quietly, cautiously. It funds research, grants fellowships, publishes studies in Vatican journals. But only some. Others, exploring psychic phenomena consciousness beyond death, evidence of buried civilizations older than Genesis, are left to wither in footnotes, or are simply denied publication altogether. The rationale is often the same. Lack of evidence, too speculative, too fringe. But underneath that is something more honest, too disruptive. Because if the world is older, stranger, more conscious than doctrine allows, then something must give. And the Vatican, though slow, has never been unwise. It understands that a truth delayed is not the same as a truth denied. Time can be its ally. It has waited before. It can wait again. Perhaps that is the real lesson of its silence. Not resistance, but patience. Because to accept a new truth is not merely to speak it. It is to restructure everything that came before. So the Church watches, studies, waits, sometimes centuries, sometimes longer, and meanwhile the stars continue their slow, luminous revolutions. The earth turns. Fossils rise from ancient dust. Photons arrive from galaxies now dead. And minds young, old, faithful, questioning keep asking, where does knowing end? And where must belief begin? Gold glows differently in the dark. In the candlelit hush of the Sistine Chapel, it shimmers not like metal, but like memory, weightless, almost holy. It clings to frescoed halos and filigreed robes. It flickers in chalices, monstrances, vestments threaded with sunlight. And when the light moves, it moves too, like a breath across centuries. The Vatican is rich, that is no secret. Its walls are lined with masterpieces. Its vaults hold treasure. Its museums house paintings, sculptures, books, bones, the inheritance of a civilization gathered beneath one dome. But richness in the context of faith is never just material. It is symbolic. It is theological. Gold in the Church is not only wealth, it is presence. The tradition dates back to the early centuries when believers once persecuted, impoverished, began to adorn their places of worship. What was once hidden in catacombs moved into basilicas. The humble bread and wine now rested on gilded altars. The cross, once a tool of torture, became a jewel. To give beauty to God, they said. To offer our finest. But what happens when beauty becomes power? when the symbol no longer points to the sacred, but replaces it. The Vatican insists that its wealth is not for luxury, that it is held in trust, preserved, protected. And in many ways this is true. The vast art collections are not private. The treasures are not sold. The Church maintains them, they say, for the world. And yet behind the glass and gold leaf a quiet discomfort lingers, because the man they claim to follow owned nothing. Jesus walked without sandals, slept beneath stars, touched lepers. He taught in parables, not palaces. He flipped the tables of money changers not to rearrange them, but to scatter them. And his only crown was made of thorns. How did that life become this palace? How did a carpenter's message become a bank? The Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, operates in near-complete secrecy. For decades, it has been the subject of speculation, scandal, and reform. It holds billions in assets. Its clients include cardinals, religious orders, Catholic institutions around the world. But its books are not fully public, and its history is far from clean. In 1982, the bank was linked to one of the most mysterious financial collapses in European history, the downfall of Banco Ambrosiano. Its chairman, Roberto Calvi, was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. In his pockets were bricks, around his neck, cash. He was nicknamed God's banker. The Vatican denied involvement. Investigations followed. But to this day, no one has been held fully accountable. Documents disappeared, testimonies changed, and the Church moved on. Because institutions are good at surviving, especially when they hold their own keys. There are efforts, of course, to reform. In recent years, new regulations have been introduced, auditors hired, transparency promised, but change is slow, and the tension remains. What does it mean when a church built on poverty manages billions? Some argue that wealth enables good, that hospitals, schools, shelters, missions all require funding, that money, like any tool, can be holy in the right hands. And maybe that's true, but maybe something else is true too, that the longer one holds gold, the heavier it becomes. Not just on the altar, but on the soul. There are chapels in Rome whose ceilings are inlaid with gold mined by hands that never touched a Bible, whose columns were funded by kings buying indulgences, whose construction swallowed entire villages in debt. They are beautiful. They are haunted. And no plaque tells you that when you enter. The Church has tried in recent decades to separate itself from this legacy. Popes have sold rings, declined limousines, worn simpler robes. Pope Francis refused to live in the papal apartment, choosing instead a modest guest house. Symbolic gestures. Meaningful, yes, but also isolated. Because beneath the gestures lies a structure, and structures are slow to change. They are built on foundations that no longer question themselves. There is a rumor unverified that in the archives of the Vatican Museum there exists a sketch for a crucifix made entirely of diamonds, commissioned by a Renaissance pope, never built. Too extravagant even then. But the sketch remains, not because of its beauty, but because of what it reveals, that even the most sacred symbols can be tempted by spectacle, that even a cross can forget what it means. And perhaps this is the deeper concern. Not that the Church is rich, but that its richness speaks louder than its silence. That gold echoes in ways prayer no longer can. That the faithful look up at domes, paintings, polished altars, and see beauty, but not hunger, not humility, not Christ, only splendor, only power. And yet beauty is not evil. The sacred has always been adorned. Cathedrals have always reached towards the sky. But when the sky becomes unreachable, when the doors become too heavy, when the gold reflects only itself, then maybe something has been lost. Not stolen, not hidden, just misplaced. And still in forgotten corners there are candles lit not by gold, but by longing. Chapels built of stone and breath. Priests who walk alone at night questioning everything they've inherited. And sometimes even marble weeps. You won't find it in the guidebooks. But if you listen, really listen, you might hear it. The sound of wealth cracking. Not from pressure, but from grace. Trying to get in. She saw the woman in white 3 times before she told anyone. The first time it was dusk. The second just before dawn. The third in the middle of a mass, though no one else seemed to notice. She never said the woman spoke, not in words anyway. Just a presence watching. Not demanding. Not offering. Just being. The woman's name was never revealed. The girl's name was. She was investigated. Questioned. Examined by priests, doctors, skeptics. And though nothing was ever proven, her parish stopped calling her by her name. They called her the one who sees. The church said it would discern further. And then it said nothing else. This story is not unique. It has happened many times in many countries under many skies. A child sees light. A woman hears a voice. A man walks into the forest and returns changed. And the Vatican watches quietly behind closed doors, because if it affirms the vision, it must explain it. And if it denies the vision, it must prove it. So often it does neither. It simply delays. The term is private revelation, a theological category meant to separate what is binding from what is not. Apparitions, visions, stigmata, locutions, they fall under this label. Real, perhaps, but not necessary. Not central. Not doctrinal. And in this distinction, the Church protects itself. It acknowledges the supernatural without being accountable to it. But what does that mean for those who experience it? For those who carry visions they never asked for? Mysticism is a dangerous thing in a hierarchical system. It cuts across rank. It arrives uninvited. It makes no appointments. And often it lands on the shoulders of the poor, the uneducated, the invisible. The ones least equipped to defend themselves. In 1858, a girl named Bernadette Soubirous claimed to see a woman in a grotto outside Lourdes. She was 14, illiterate, sick. The church at first was skeptical. Officials questioned her again and again. But the crowds came. The healings began. And eventually, the Vatican approved the apparition. With conditions. Statues were built, shrines erected, pilgrimages sanctioned. But Bernadette herself was pushed to the margins, sent to a convent, seldom heard again. When she died, her body was exhumed displayed. Her story had become property. A relic! And relics do not speak. The same pattern has echoed through history, at Fatima, at Medjugorje, at Akita. Ordinary people experience something extraordinary. The Church observes, measures, waits. If the vision affirms doctrine, it is cautiously received. If it disrupts doctrine, it is quietly discouraged. And if it says nothing at all, it is forgotten. But what if the silence is the point? What if the sacred refuses to be translated? There are visionaries who speak of light so intense they could not open their eyes, voices that said nothing and everything, shapes that melted when named. encounters that left no theology, only transformation. These are the stories the Church does not know how to handle, because they offer no frame, no proof, no obedience, and yet they continue, not because people want them, but because they come. Mystical experience is older than the Church, older than religion. It is a part of human consciousness, the threshold between language and presence. Some traditions embrace it fully: the Sufis, the Zen monks, the Desert Fathers. But the Vatican has always walked a careful line. Mysticism, yes, but under supervision. Experience, yes, but only when it echoes doctrine. Anything else is shadow, or delusion, or danger, and perhaps there is danger, not from God, but from the unraveling of certainty, because visions do not arrive with footnotes. They do not explain themselves. And once someone has seen, they cannot unsee. What happens when a nun claims to hear the Virgin daily? When a priest says he levitates in prayer? When a layperson dreams of a city he has never visited and then finds it exactly as it was? What happens when the boundary between heaven and earth thins? The Church has a system, a protocol for miracles, a checklist for apparitions. Doctors, theologians, psychologists are consulted. Years may pass. The faithful wait. And when a judgment comes, it is rarely absolute. We find nothing contrary to the faith. Or, we urge caution pending further evidence. But what if the evidence was never meant to be measurable? What if the vision was not a message, but an invitation, an opening, an unraveling? There is a phrase found in the journal of an anonymous mystic stored deep in the Vatican archives. It reads, "The truth did not speak to me, it unmade me. No theologian ever cited it, no council ever quoted it. But the journal remains, unread, not because it is false, but because it cannot be controlled. And perhaps that is the Vatican's greatest challenge. Not heresy, not rebellion, but the wildness of God, the wind that blows where it will, the light that lands on unexpected faces, the silence that speaks only when no one is asking. So the Church waits. It studies, it verifies, it decides, but always the visions come, before the verdict. And always the light falls, just beyond the reach of doctrine. History is not written in ink. It is written in silence, in the spaces between words, in the edits no one admits were made, in the names that vanish from one century to the next. And few institutions have shaped silence more skillfully or more enduringly than the Church. The Vatican holds archives, yes, vaults, volumes, a history of millennia. But what it also holds is something quieter, harder to trace. A memory machine. Not a place, not even a system, but a slow, deliberate habit of choosing what is remembered, and more delicately, what is not. The saints we know were once the rebels we feared. Francis of Assisi preached barefoot, begged for food-kissed lepers. He refused wealth, refused power, refused even the structure of the Church. He was nearly condemned until he wasn't. Years later, he was canonized, statues raised, churches built. But what about the ones who weren't? The names that almost became saints and didn't. There was a woman in 14th century France who wandered from village to village healing the sick and speaking of a God who needed no churches, no intermediaries. She called herself a daughter of the silence. Her followers wrote nothing down. They simply walked and listened. She was arrested, never formally tried. Her name was struck from the parish records. No one canonized her, no one burned her either. She was just forgotten, and sometimes that is more efficient. Because erasure requires no flames, only time, only enough quiet to outlast memory. In 1969, the Vatican revised the general Roman calendar, the official list of saints whose feast days are recognized across the world. It was in part a necessary reform. Some names were duplicates. Others had little historical evidence, but many were removed for another reason. Too obscure, too complicated, too local. Saint Philomena, Saint Christopher, Saint Ursula. No longer considered universal. Their cults were not banned, but they were no longer encouraged. And over the years, their images were taken down. Their prayers faded. New generations grew up never hearing their names. This is how forgetting works. Not through denial, but through neglect. The Church never has to say this never happened. It only has to stop saying, this did. And yet the memories resist. In small villages, people still light candles to saints the Vatican no longer recognizes, still whisper prayers not found in catechisms, still walk labyrinths beneath chapels built on older foundations, sites of rituals older than Christianity itself. These layers remain, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, where the Church cannot reach without breaking its own reflection. There are saints who were once heretics, and heretics who in another age might have been saints. Giordano Bruno, burned in 1600. Not for magic, not for rebellion, but for saying that the stars were suns, that the universe was infinite, that God was too big for one doctrine. He was never forgiven, but he was never forgotten. Today, a statue of Bruno stands in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome, the square where he died. He faces the Vatican, hooded, silent, unyielding. The Church has never apologized for his death, because to do so would be to admit that memory is malleable, and malleability is dangerous. What else might be reconsidered? Which other stories might need to be rewritten? There are libraries of testimony, not doctrinal, not verified, that speak of mystics denied sainthood because they refused to obey, because they dreamed too vividly, because they questioned the structure of salvation. A nun in 17th century Spain wrote of a light that came not from heaven, but from inside her chest. A priest in 19th century Poland claimed to hear music in the sacraments, but only when the congregation was silent. A child in Brazil drew pictures of angels that resembled no known iconography faces, made of water wings, like roots' eyes without edges. None of them were celebrated. None of them were condemned. They were simply put away. Their visions stored in drawers, their words placed in files marked pending discernment, their stories faded from liturgy. And maybe that's the most haunting thing of all, that the Church doesn't need to destroy. It only needs to delay, long enough for the noise of the world to bury the strange, long enough for history to move forward without turning its head. But stories are stubborn, and memory leaks. In old prayer books, names reappear. In chants sung by nuns in forgotten convents, the rhythm of erased saints returns. In the quiet faith of those who never cared for approval, holiness lives without permission. And the question lingers, what has been lost, not from malice, not from conspiracy, but from the slow erosion of attention? Who might we have become if different stories had been allowed to stay? If different saints had been honored? If the Church had trusted the strange, not just tolerated it? The Vatican will not answer. Its silence is its shield, Its silence is its strength. But beneath that silence is a room, and in that room a drawer, and in that drawer a name. No longer spoken. Still waiting. The last hallway has no doors. Deep beneath the Vatican, past archives, past vaults, past tombs and towers of parchment, there is said to be a corridor that leads nowhere. Its walls are smooth, its ceiling low. The lights flicker just once when you enter, then hold steady. Always quiet, always cold. It isn't marked on any blueprint, and no one admits to walking it. But janitors speak of it. Archivists lower their voices when it comes up. A few whisper that it was once meant to be a passage between buildings unfinished, never used. Others say it was intentional, built as a gesture, not a function. A hallway for what the church cannot speak, for what it chooses not to remember. Along one wall in faint brush strokes is an inscription almost lost to age. 4 words, Latin half erased. Non omnia claudantur verbo. Not all things are closed by words. No one knows who wrote it. No one admits to translating it. But somehow everyone understands. Because the deeper you go into the structure, into the story, into the sanctuary, the more you feel it, the weight of what has not been said. The hidden room, the forbidden text, the silent saint. The church is a body, a nation, a mystery. It is also a vault. And in that vault are truths not denied but suspended like breath before a question. Over 20 centuries it has shaped the memory of a world. It has preserved language, buried language, invented new language. It has canonized and condemned. It has crowned kings and survived collapse. It has held the chalice and the sword. And still it endures. But endurance is not the same as transparency. Not all of God's words are spoken in Latin. Not all of his gestures are made through marble. And not all of his truths are meant to be controlled. This is not a call for rebellion. It is not even a call. It is a pause, because somewhere far from archives and altars, someone still kneels in a room with no icons, no incense, no name, and they feel the presence. They feel it before the creed, before the rules, before the titles. They feel the thing the church was built to protect, but sometimes forgets to see. The divine, raw, unfiltered, vast, not as judgment, but as silence, not as doctrine, but as breath. And perhaps this is what the Vatican fears most. Not error, but encounter. Because encounter cannot be scripted. It cannot be filed. It cannot be revised after councils. It cannot be passed through chain of command. It simply is, and when it comes, it does not ask for permission. It comes to peasants and prisoners, children and outcasts. It comes in dreams, in fire, in wind, in stillness. It comes without Latin, without gold, without keys. So the church watches and waits. It preserves what it can, hides what it must, protects what it believes, and in doing so, it keeps the structure standing. But structures forget. They forget the wildness they once tried to hold. They forget the darkness they once stepped into by faith. They forget that the first Mass was whispered, in fear, not triumph. And so we arrive again, at the hallway with no doors. A passage carved not for walking, but for remembering. A space that leads nowhere so you can hear what remains. And what remains is not conspiracy, not scandal, but a question, the same question that has hovered since Peter first stepped into Rome. The same question behind every locked vault, every redacted letter, every sealed tomb. The question no one in marble dares say aloud. Does God need us? Does he need a crown? A title? A building? A throne? Or has he been standing barefoot in the shadows all along, waiting not to be worshipped? But to be noticed. Not as ruler, but as witness. Not above, but beside. Waiting not for incense, but for silence. Not for obedience, but for attention. And so we end not with closure, but with breath. Because some truths do not need to be revealed. They only need to be remembered. Or perhaps felt. Like a hallway that doesn't go anywhere. Like a book you're not supposed to open. Like a voice that never quite speaks, but never entirely disappears.